Future Warrior, the Mars Campaign. Chapter 12. The Red Legion commander was far from happy. His corps had failed in the initial and now in the secondary attempt to take the UEDF bases, and his higher command was far from impressed with his failure. His failure, he scoffed at that. If he had been given the time he had asked for, he would have succeeded. No, it was not his failure, but that of others. Now, finally, he had been given the time he had asked for, and he would smash the stubborn UEDF defense. Within an hour, the attack would begin. He had met with the other 3 corps commanders and the leader of the mecha assigned to this attack, and they all had agreed to his proposals. They had to hit somewhere hard. They were facing weakened armor divisions on the UEDF flanks and mechanized and infantry positions in a defense in depth in the center. Infantry. He mused to himself. Those damned assault infantry had arrived just in time to blunt his last attack. If not for them, he would have taken the bases in his last attempt. He smiled, a twisted smile that exposed his blackening teeth. This time, not even they would stop him. The Red Legion would prevail. It was inevitable. As he smiled, he knew that 2 full corps, plus the bulk of the mecha force, were nearly ready to strike the right flank and seize FOB Warlock. The other remaining full-strength corps would menace the left flank, while his weakened corps would send in spoiling attacks against the center of the UEDF lines. When the right flank crumbled, they would roll up the UEDF line from one end to the other, catching the defenders facing the wrong way. His scouts said the UEDF was deployed to counter either a pincer movement or an attack on the center, so he would hit them with a right hook, a knockout punch that would regain the initiative for the Red Legion. Despite their best efforts, the UEDF divisions defending the bases were doomed. They just didn't know it yet. Stalker was glad to once again be surrounded by soldiers from his own division. To his left and right, he saw black-armored Terra Nova. Further to his right, with his enhanced vision, Stalker could also make out the purple figures of Praetorians, as well as blue Crusaders, white Excaliburs, and gold/silver Vikings, all intermixed with squads of green Philistines. Surrounded by so many assault troops, he felt like anything was possible, that they would be victorious no matter the odds. D had put it differently, saying earlier that regardless, they would die in good company. Stalker looked to his left and spied D behind a burnout APC. As if sensing his scrutiny, D looked over, and Stalker saw him nod slightly. Stalker nodded back. They were going to make it. The Terra Nova forces, around 500 or so, were located near the end of the line. To his left, the 5th Armored had deployed most of its remaining tanks in preparation for the expected enemy pincer movement. Stalker could see FOB Warlock in the distance behind him and could just pick out the infantry lines and the occasional scurrying soldier. Stalker took in his immediate surroundings. He was with 4 other Terra Nova troops behind the smoking hulk of a massive Devastator tank. The vehicle painted the dirty red of the Red Legion fanatics. The tank itself was half on top of a shattered wreck that had once been an Ironhide IFV. It seemed that the Devastator had been reversing over it when it had been hit. A closer inspection revealed a charred body halfway out of the commander's cupola. It was burnt beyond recognition. Stalker could just pick out the bones beneath the blackened tissue, and again he was glad of his sealed suit, so he couldn't smell the cooked flesh, a distinctive smell all veteran soldiers knew and never forgot. There were about a dozen other bodies in the immediate area, apparently the crew and passengers of the Ironhide who hadn't been killed immediately when it had been hit. By the scorch marks in the metal, Stalker guessed it was glanced by plasma fire from an assassin tank. Stalker took a closer look at one of the dead men. He was dressed in UEA issue standard battle armor, and his discarded IW-30 lay nearby where it had fallen. He was not wearing a helmet, and his head was shaved except for a strip down the center, while each side of his face bore 2 symbols cut deep into the flesh. The mutilation apparently self-inflicted. The face itself also a mask of tattoos and symbols which Stalker had never seen before and never wanted to again. Stalker also noted that the shoulder patches on the uniform had been roughly cut out, leaving holes in the cross-weaved fabric and exposing the shoulder armor plates. The dead man was obviously a former UEDF soldier, possibly from the Martian Corps garrison. If it had not been for his full helmet, Stalker would have spat on the corpse. Fucking traitor. Stalker's helmet microphone crackled. It was the Philistin CEO who had assuming command of the defense. "This is Chariot to all forces, stand to, stand to." With those simple words, Stalker, since things were about to heat up, obviously the Strider scouts had detected enemy activity. Stalker knew at that moment, even as he crouched in the late afternoon sunshine, that all along the line, thousands of warriors from Earth had just stopped their idle chatter and had tightened their grips on weapons. It was the deep breath before the plunge. Stalker stood slowly and peered in the distance. On the horizon was a growing cloud of dust. Almost none of the crops still stood on the plain, and burnt patches marked the location of wrecks or weapon impacts. The wind blew constantly, and, as always, it was filled with fine sand, even if there was less than normal thanks to the crops and the irrigation of the red earth in Cydonia. Stalker's comm net crackled to life again. D had patched what he was getting through, so everyone could hear. Fighting had erupted at the other end of the line. A divisional-sized attack was in progress, but was being held. Stalker knew that the Reds had as many as 40 divisions. What were they playing at? Was this simply reconnaissance in force? His thoughts were interrupted by an outbreak of tank and missile fire, the distant sounds amplified by his helmet's acoustic systems. Then Stalker began to see red, armored vehicles coming over the ridgeline in the distance to his front. Stalker didn't need to talk to the men around him. They all knew the plan. Let the enemy get close and begin a pass. Then, when the Reds attacked the infantry and armor positions further back, the assault troops would engage, hopefully causing confusion and trapping a large number of Reds between the two forces. It was risky, as there was the danger of friendly fire, but the infantry would hit the vehicles closest to them, and by definition, farthest from the assault troops. That, and luck, would hopefully minimize any risks while maximizing hitting power. Stalker, for one, agreed that it was worth the risk. The defenders needed every advantage they could get. While the sound of battle on the extreme left flank carried in the distance, the line around Stalker remained silent as the red armor rolled forward, the formations becoming divided by the mass of wrecked vehicles and debris clogging the fields. With the enemy now only a few hundred meters away and the tank, APC, and IFE turrets sweeping back and forth looking for resistance, the line remained silent. The UEDF defenders holding their fire in a game of nerves and discipline. The Red Legion commander of the lead battalion was beginning to believe that the UEDF had pulled back. He had ordered his troop commanders to deploy the infantry as soon as they were engaged, but not until then, so they would be as close to the enemy as possible. He would not go in with the infantry walking alongside and in front of the armor as in the last attack. That had resulted in the infantry being lost and the armor being assaulted by enemy infantry units. No, he would wait so his vehicles would have close support. Stalker held his breath as the first Red Legion vehicles rolled past his position and thanked whatever god there was that they had gone unnoticed. More and more vehicles rolled slowly past, and Stalker waited patiently for the word to attack. About 20 or so vehicles had passed, moving on through the debris field when he finally heard the command on the comm net. Raiden, Raiden, Raiden. The world around him suddenly lit up with a cacophony of noise. All around there was the whoosh of slap anti-tank rockets, the sound of impulse fire striking metal, the pop of 50mm heat grenades, innumerable explosions, and weapons fire of every size and type. Next to him, two of the men who had slap launchers raised and each fired, hitting a passing tank in the rear before dropping the now useless tubes and pouring grenade and impulse fire into any visible target. Stalker first engaged an Ironhide, which had just passed on his left, hitting in the rear of its squat turret with a well-aimed 50mm grenade before pouring a 45 RD magazine of impulse fire into the rear passenger doors. Despite the armor on the doors, some of the 12mm impulse ammunition punched through and shredded the 8 shock troops inside, turning the passenger compartment of the IFE into a carnal house. Stalker switched to a Warthog that had already been hit and had smoke issuing from the open passenger doors, through which shocked-looking Reds were half running, half falling out. Squeezing off rounds with brutal accuracy, Stalker, and another man targeted and cut the Reds to pieces. Stalker seeing chunks of flesh fly as the explosive tipped impulse ammunition hit. Stalker in a brief moment marveled in the way that each round's fuse could sense the density of what it struck, and if it was armor penetrated before detonating. Where a round encountered less dense material, such as flesh, the warhead would detonate on impact with truly spectacular results. Around Stalker's squad, a tank, 2 Ironhides, and a Warthog now lay immobile, all either smoking or ablaze, all surrounded by dead or dying enemy soldiers. The computer in Stalker's helmet, amongst the cataclysm of noise, detected a new sound, and calculating a 73% chance of it being important to the wearer boosted this one sound in Stalker's earpiece. Stalker heard the distinctive noise of a tank engine just in time to look left and see an assassin tank, painted the now distinctive dirty red, come from the left around the wreckage they were using as cover. Its plasma cannon facing in their direction. Tank left, displace. Displace. Stalkers and the others around him were up on their feet fast and running, firing on the move as they went. As they scattered, Stalker fired at the tank with a 50mm heat grenade. The grenade got through the tank's active defenses and hit the turret's front glacis, but did little more than scratch the advanced armor. The assassin's RWS machine guns opened up on the scattering troops, catching one. The heavy 15mm rounds punching through the soldier's EEA suit and sending him sprawling. The other machine gun targeted Stalker, who dived behind the burning Warthog just as rounds licked at his heels. One of the other troops, who had taken cover behind an Ironhide turret, now detached from its former owner, peppered the RWS before he too had to take cover as one of the guns switched to him. He rose up again just in time to be eviscerated by the massive blast of the tank's plasma cannon. The whole area for a brief moment illuminated in a brilliant blue. With its turret and RWS guns facing the other way, Stalker broke cover and quickly detached an electro-flashbang grenade from a clip on his chest. Turning the dial on top to impact detonation, he threw it with trained accuracy at the RWS mount. Stalker looked away, and there was a bright flash, and electricity and sparks splashed in every direction. Stalker jumped up and ran straight at the tank, its turret now swinging his direction. Stalker just beat the speed of the traversing turret and clambered up on the tank, just as he felt his hair stand on end. With a bright flash, the plasma cannons fired into the earth where he had been only a few seconds before, sending charred red dirt flying and leaving a smoking hole in the ground. Now on top of the tank, in one fluid movement, Stalker grabbed a compact C6-shaped charge from a clip on his thigh, turned the dial to 10, and attached it under the rear turret overhang, as far as he could reach. With a jerk that almost made Stalker fall, the assassin began to move. Stalker jumped off the rear of the moving tank, landing badly and rolling in a heap. As Stalker rolled upright, the assassin's turret began to swing towards him. Then, with a flash and a resonating crack, the C6 charge detonated, pushing the turret half off the tank. The tank continued to roll slowly on, but it was clear the crew were dead, the tank continuing on until it hit a wrecked Wasp and stalled. Stalker picked himself up and at once felt pain in his leg. "Damn it," he said to no one in particular, and limping moved to where the two others, one covering and one giving aid, were gathered by the soldier wounded by the RWS. The rate of fire all around was constant, although it was now more small arms and grenades, with all the heavier anti-tank weapons having been used up in the first few minutes. "That was a thing of beauty. You okay, Stalker?" said the man covering. Stalker had a mental blank and couldn't remember the man's name, despite having talked to him only minutes before the attack. "Fine specialist. What's his status?" "He's seen better days, took 3 hits, and is losing a bit of blood." "I'm good to fight, boss," the man said, his expression hidden behind his helmet, but his voice was strained. "Patch him up as best you can. We could get the order to move any minute and no one gets left behind." The man giving aid didn't look up, but kept working fast and pulled out a small pressure can with a tube-like nozzle. He pressed the nozzle into the wounds one after another, squirting a bioplastic trauma sealant into the wounds to seal them and stop the blood loss. The ground around them suddenly kicked up with the impact of incoming small arms fire. Stalker went down on his good knee, and with the others returned fire at several red figures scurrying amongst the wreckage in the distance. The comm net burst to life. Echo, echo, echo. That's the fallback command. You two grab him and fall back. I'll cover you. Watch your 360. Stalker poured a few more rounds in the direction of the enemy to keep their heads down and glanced over his shoulder. Good. The others had the wounded man between them and were half dragging, half carrying him at best speed to the rear, rifles grasped in their spare hands as they moved. Stalker waited another 10 seconds more, squeezing off the last few rounds in his magazine, and then popped a smoke grenade before limping began to withdraw. Rounds continued to pierce through the smoke all around him. He had lost sight of the others, but they were able to look after themselves. His leg ached, and it slowed his progress. The battlefield around Stalker was a strange world of wrecked vehicles, smoke, fire, and death. Here, and their tracer rounds flashed, and were answered by blue bolts of impulse fire through the haze. Stalker froze as he heard running footsteps and brought his rifle up towards the sound. Out of a plume of black smoke came a red officer leading a number of disheveled-looking tattooed men. Stalker dropped one hand from his raised rifle, and drawing a frag grenade from his hip, threw it with full force at the officer who by now had seen him and had begun to yell something unintelligible. The hurtling grenade hit the officer squarely in the face, and in shock he tripped and fell. At the same moment, the grenade detonated in all its ferocity, and the surrounding area was sprayed with hypervelocity metal fragments to awful effect. Stalker didn't pause to see if any survived the blast, and instead kept moving, bits of rogue shrapnel passing close by with an audible zing. Stalker guessed he had covered about half the distance back to the infantry lines when he heard firing close by. Peering over some debris, he saw about a dozen Red Legion troops exchanging fire with the infantry's lines. There was also an IFV of some type, a modified Ironhide by the look of it, adding fire with twin cannons partially concealed behind some wreckage. Stalker ducked back down and did a quick check of his ammunition. He had one smoke and one frag grenade, 3 50mm heat grenades, and several magazines for his ASBR. He unclipped both the smoke and frag grenades and set them to 5 seconds. Then one following the other threw them at the infantry before swinging his rifle onto the IFV and pumping the 3 heat grenades into it. There were a number of rapid detonations, followed by cries as men were cut down. Stalker crawled to the end of the debris he was using for cover, and rifle leading the way peered around it. The IFV had fallen silent and was smoking, and around it there were a handful of dead and dying Reds on the ground. The smoke was starting to thicken, and the surviving Reds were firing wildly in all directions, unsure where the threat lay. With cold precision, Stalker sighted up and dropped 3 Reds before they even knew where the shots were coming from. As he sighted up on a 4th, he heard a thump and saw a grenade land near his head. Without thinking, he rolled away from it, completing 3 rolls before it detonated with a crump, scattering rocks and earth. On his 4th roll, Stalker moved into a crouch, but couldn't see any enemy as the smoke grenade clouded the entire area. Stalker began to skirt around to the left, and seeing movement spun around, coming face to face with a wicked-looking Eliminator rifle in the hands of a green-armored Philistine scout sniper. The sniper didn't speak, but made a move-up signal with his hand, and Stalker saw 5 more Philistines seemingly appear out of nowhere and move past him through the smoke with their rifles up. Stalker moved to follow, but the sniper put a hand on his shoulder and halted him. Shortly after, there were a number of rapid shots, and blue flashes could be seen through the smoke. One of the Philistines came back and signaled all clear. The Philistines saw Stalker's limp and lent a hand. With the scout sniper and his long rifle leading the way, they moved through the smoke, passing the crumpled outlines of dead Reds, and back towards the relative safety of the main lines. Stalker was helped through the lines by the beefy Philistine, and after being issued a pain injection by a medic, contacted D. Alpha Epsilon 2-1. Say again, Alpha Epsilon 2-1. This is Bravo Epsilon, sitrep, over. A moment later, Stalker was relieved to hear D's voice came back loud and clear. Roger, Bravo Epsilon. Situation is 009er. Report to phase line, Charlie Sierra. Stalker acknowledged and moved to the planned fallback position closer to FOB Warlock. The numerical code, meaning that they were in a tactical meeting. As Stalker arrived limping, he saw Big D, Javinus, Sure, and a number of others in animated conversation. Something was going on. "Glad you're here, Stalker. We've got ourselves a big problem." A dirty-looking tank commander got off his comm. "It's no good, they will be here in half an hour." As the others talked, D leaned closer. "The Reds have wrong-footed us. They're hitting us all along the line, but they hit the 5th Armored and 11th Mechanized on our flank with what looks like 2 full corps and mecha. The 5th and 11th are engaged in a fighting retreat, but are being overrun." Stalker sighed and looked back towards the line where another firefight was developing. "I knew that attack didn't feel right. They came in a dumb." Sure spoke up, bringing them all back to focus. "The Philistines are detaching from the front. We will bring our entire remaining strength to this end of the line and deploy at right angles. We will then fight to the death. If we don't hold them, the line will fall, and the bases with it." The others agreed, and all of the senior assault division commanders quickly moved to pull out as much as they could to reinforce the Philistines' planned new defensive line. With the details quickly agreed, the meeting broke up, and everyone hurried to get their men repositioned. Stalker and D went to the section of line where the Terra Nova had gathered, dodging artillery and scattered small arms fire as they went. D and Stalker went down the line, taking 2 assault troops and 3, the infantry looking decidedly unimpressed with the thinning of their assault troop support when they were under fire. Within a surprisingly short time, the area around FOB Warlock was swarming with green armored Philistines and a smaller number of warriors from the other divisions of the 10 involved in the defense. There was no time for anything fancy, and as the men arrived, they found any cover they could and prepared for the battle to come. Artillery was now falling close to the base itself, and the distant sounds of battle could be heard coming from over a slope to the left of the old front line, the noise beginning to grow louder. Stalker looked up at the sun. It was low in the sky now. He felt tired beyond comprehension and was only running on adrenaline. Sure, D, Javinus, and Stalker took up a position together in a plascrete ditch alongside of the base to form a CP. Sure spoke first. "I got through to TACCOM. They said there is help on the way, and we're to hold on as long as we can." "Well, remind me to thank Captain Obvious when we get through this. It's not like we have anywhere else to go, is it?" retorted Javinus. And for a brief moment, despite their collective weariness and knowledge that there was a strong chance of them all being killed within the hour where they lay, they shared a laugh. The minutes seemed to drag on for hours, with each passing minute bringing more and more troops arriving from further down the line. The APCs that brought them turning around to dash back for more passengers. Stalker had just opened his mouth to speak when Sure shouted over the growing thud of artillery, "Movement front!" Stalker saw battered tanks and armored vehicles of every type beginning to stream over the rise, their turrets facing back in the direction they were coming from. "Friendlies," Javinus said to no one in particular. Stalker couldn't help but notice how few of them there were, and that every vehicle without exception bore signs of damage. One Devastator even having its turret jammed, facing side-on. Stalker looked to Sure beside him. He was trying without success to raise the Philistine Stratoscouts. The tension in the air was palatable. Then all at once the storm broke with a flash that lit up the rapidly darkening sky like summer lightning. Coming from the left of Stalker's vision, the bright blue flash of a railgun sped across the field in an instant, impacting a retreating 5th Armored Assassin tank. The powerful shot piercing the tank's armor, killing its crew instantly, and leaving a gaping melted hole in the side of the big MBT's turret. On cue, other vehicles were struck by more rail fire, quickly joined by missiles and the red and green beams of sniper and pulse cannons. When Stalker identified the source of the fire, he was lost for words as what looked like hundreds of red mecha and striders came skimming on their ion thrusters across the distant fields to the rear of Warlock. Amongst them were at least 4 larger machines that could only be Goliaths. At that precise moment, the steel masses of the Red Legion armored and mechanized divisions poured over the ridges in front in pursuit of the retreating UEDF forces. There was no time to think or to feel fear. everyone's training kicked in, and the few vehicles that had corkscrew missiles fired them. While from the assault troops, a few, remaining Cobra and a tank, missiles lanced out towards the enemy. But it was only a pinprick to the mass of the advancing forces, and they didn't slow as they shrugged off the incoming fire. As Stalker watched in mute fascination, the last of the UEA armor was annihilated before his eyes, the 5th Armored and 11th Mechanized ceasing to exist. Then in a moment that seemed to slow in time, the hard-charging Red forces closed with the hastily prepared UEDF lines, packed with as many as 25,000 grim-faced assault troops. Without slowing, the Red formations crashed headlong into the lines, and the world around Stalker descended into chaos. The leading elements of the Red divisions didn't pause as they roared straight over the defenses at full speed, passing through the hailstorm of fire put up by the defender and on into the base itself. Once inside, they rapidly began dispersing infantry and pouring out fire in all directions. Stalker saw a tank roll over 3 Philistines in a hastily dug slit trench and crush them to a bloody pulp under its churning tracks and 90-ton bulk. More grenades were going off than could be counted, many of them multispectral smoke as the defenders fought for any advantage against the torrent of fire from the mass of enemy vehicles. About a dozen IFVs rolled past either side of the CP, and Stalker and the others poured impulse fire into their sides as they passed. Then, without warning, Red infantry engulfed them. Stalker was firing on Ironhide when he was bodily knocked to the side as a well-built and terribly scarred Red Legion soldier crashed into him, the bayonet on his IW-30 getting caught in Stalker's chest plate. The burly Red then grabbed for Stalker's impulse rifle, and for a second Stalker resisted before releasing one hand and sending it flying open-palmed into the other man's face, knocking his respirator mask off and breaking his nose in a gush of blood. As the Red fell, he released the grip on Stalker's rifle, and Stalker brought it down, but first into the prone figure's head, hearing a sickening crack as the skull gave way under the force of the impact. Dropping the rifle, Stalker had just enough time to draw his pistol and knife as 3 more Reds rushed him, rifles spraying wildly from their hips as they ran. Stalker shot the first one in the face, sending him sprawling, ignoring the impacts he felt on his EEA from multiple hits. Then the others were on him. One man smashed his IW-30 into Stalker's helmet, and in return Stalker head-butted him, knocking the Red to the ground. The other Red shot Stalker point-blank with a pistol. The impacts as the man emptied the entire magazine into Stalker's chest felt like hammer blows, and in a supreme effort Stalker brought his armored hand up and uppercut the shocked Red with his spiked fist. As the man fell in a bright splash of blood, the spikes caught under the man's jawbone, and his dead weight dragged Stalker down, his knee giving out as he tried desperately to get his hand free. The Red he had head-butted earlier dived on him and brought a knife down on Stalker's face, but it didn't penetrate the visor and instead skipped across it, scoring the surface. Stalker brought his pistol and his free hand down, but first, and smashed it into the top of the man's head, knocking him out cold, then put 3 rounds into his back for good measure. As Stalker tried to regain his senses and pulled his bloody hand free, he saw the entire battlefield was now masked in billowing clouds of smoke, which combined with the failing light had brought visibility down to only meters. All around there could be seen the struggling shapes of men locked in hand-to-hand combat, and the larger shapes of vehicles moving. Here, in their tracer rounds pierced the smoky gloom, and there was the meaty sounds of heavy impacts on flesh as men fought with boot, butt, and bayonet. These weren't the only sounds picked up by Stalker helmet sensors. There were men swearing and cursing, gunfire of all types, and the occasional distinctive crump of a grenade. But another sound also permeated the battlefield. All around were the rallying calls of the UEDF's warrior elite. In a brief moment of clarity, Stalker heard them all. The calls of "All enemies of Earth die" of the Praetorians. "For the lady" from Excalibur's. "The God wills it" from the Crusaders. "The thunder upon the earth" of the Vikings. The "take no prisoners" of the Philistines. And lastly, the "death to all" of his own Terra Nova. All around him, the assault troops voiced their defiance as they fought and died. More Reds abruptly charged out of the smoke. Stalker emptied his Z8A pistol into the onrushing men, dropping the leading few, but then with a click the magazine ran dry. In desperation, he hurled the now useless pistol at the Reds, and reaching to his side, grasped the hilt of the ceremonial sword. Stalker just managed to draw and bring the sword up as they reached him. The leading man's eyes bulged in shock as he saw the long ceramic blade appear seemingly from nowhere, and in his surprise has tried to backpedal and slipped, falling on his back. The man immediately behind fell over him, the momentum carrying him forward. Stalker, more on instinct than through any training, shifted his weight to his back foot and slashed the sword upwards, catching the stumbling man across the throat. The force behind the swing almost took the man's head clean off, blood spraying from the terrible wound. Stalker knew he had to take advantage of the momentary confusion, and despite the crippling pain from his leg, he charged the stumbling group of men. One of the Reds managed to bring his rifle to bear just as Stalker crashing into him, hip and shouldering the man out of the way. In a blur, Stalker spun and slashed in all directions, barely conscious of the blade's impacts. He got in several strokes before his legs were pulled out from under him and he went sprawling to the ground. As he landed bodily on the hard earth, a Red tried to jump on him and was impaled as Stalker brought the sword up on reflex. As the man rolled over, the sword still sticking from him, Stalker felt a tugging at his feet and saw a Red sporting a gaping slash to his shoulder, holding onto his legs. Reversing the grip of his combat knife, Stalker brought it down onto the man's closest hand, the blade passing clear through and becoming stuck in Stalker's EA leg armor. The man roared with pain and released his remaining hand from Stalker's leg. As Stalker staggered to his feet, the knife blade combined with the man's weight to pull the razor-sharp blade clean through the Red's hand, the knife remaining stuck firmly in Stalker's suit's leg. Stalker pulled the sword out of the first Red and swiftly finished off the prone man without even a second thought, before quickly retrieving and reloading his rifle. Looking around, Stalker saw the others were still alive and were surrounded by bodies, although Schur was wounded from a round taken through his thigh. The smoke was starting to thin and there were burning vehicles all around. Many of the base buildings were on fire, and a nearby hangar had collapsed completely. There was a loud thud and the ground shook. Stalker and the others spun around and saw a mech had just landed right next to them. It was bipedal with reverse-joined legs and was armed with 2 large-caliber shoulder-mounted multi-barrel autocannons. There was a loud, ripping metallic buzz, and hundreds of tracers marked the arc of fire as the mech fired a burst at some distant target. Then, with a boost that knocked them all to the ground, the mech jumped on its ion boosters and landed somewhere inside the base perimeter out of sight. There had been no time to react, although they sent several impulse rounds chasing after it as it left. Schur called out a warning, and as Stalker turned, he saw a section of 3 massive mecha come skimming towards them. They appear to be the same pattern as the one he had seen in Elysium. The formation broke with the 2 on the sides breaking left and right, and with the center one coming straight at them, its massive frame seeming to fill their vision. As it bore down on them, it launched 2 salvos of cluster rockets that impacted on the edge of the ditch, sending earth and chunks of plascrete in every direction. Stalker was thrown several feet and landed with a meaty thud, just regaining his senses to see the mech continue past them without halting. There was a loud whoosh as yet another mech roared past, Stalker only seeing a red blur as it sped by. Stalker heard impulse fire, and still laying on the ground, unsure if he could move, saw D and Javina's firing. Turning his head, Stalker followed the direction of the blue shots and saw them ricocheting off a Red Strider. The Strider was tearing through a squad of Philistines. Ignoring the fire directed at it, the Strider brought down its foot on one Philistin, crushing the life out of him. Without pause, it grabbed another green-armored soldier and threw him, his body disappearing from sight through the smoke. Then, with an eerie, bluish-purple glow, it incinerated another Philistin where he stood as he tried desperately to put a fresh grenade magazine into his rifle. With a burst of dust In swirling smoke, the Strider boosted up and out of sight before a second later coming down and landing behind D and Javinus. With a smooth movement, it kicked D, sending him skidding, and grabbed Javinus in one of its metal fists. Stalker could only watch as slowly and deliberately it brought the struggling Javinus up to the front of the Strider's cockpit. Javinus could feel his ribs breaking, and as he looked into the dark tinted cockpit, he saw the vision lenses spin and adjust as they focused on him. Javinus knew he was going to die, but he was damned if he was going alone. With his last ounce of strength, even as the life was squeezed out of him, he managed to reach down and grab something off his thigh. Then he smashed his fist into the front of the cockpit, sticking the item to it. All enemies of Earth die. In the cockpit of the Strider, the Red Legion pilot heard the defiant cry, and squinting, he just recognized the small disc shape of a C6 charge before it detonated. Stalker heard Javinus yell out in defiance, and a moment later, there was a powerful explosion, and Javinus and the Strider disintegrated. The wrecked Strider collapsing in a pile of burning, twisted wreckage. The destruction of the Strider didn't go unnoticed, and as Stalker tried to get up, his body racked with spasms of pain, 2 Red Legion mecha came skimming up. One was the reverse-jointed type with the twin cannons that he had seen earlier. The other looked like the Elysium type, except instead of twin missile pods on its shoulders, it had a single massive folded-up sniper cannon. While one of its arms was empty, with only an armored hand, the other was holding a wicked-looking railgun. Stalker doubled over in pain and collapsed, coughing blood. All he could think was how weak he must have looked to the crews of the armored behemoths in front of him, and that he didn't want to die looking so helpless. He saw the body of the first mech swivel and bring the cannons to bear on him, the barrels beginning to spool up. There was a flash of light, and before his eyes the mech exploded, falling backwards on its reverse-jointed legs as they lost power with a resounding crash, followed by a deafening series of explosions as the onboard munitions began to detonate in spectacular secondaries. The second mech reacted instantly and spun with what seemed to Stalker to be almost inhuman grace. As it turned, the massive sniper cannon on its back unfolded from its transport position to its ready position, pointing forward over the mech's shoulder. The air, dust, and smoke were all drawn towards the barrel of the cannon as it charged. Then with a flash that illuminated everything around in eerie red light, the sniper cannon fired at some distant target. The mech then lurched forward and boosted away, skimming on its thrusters in a cloud of red dust. As he lay there on his back, the sounds of battle all around, his teeth gritted against the pain, Stalker wondered if any of his friends were still alive and what was happening. The flow of information having stopped as the TACnet was jammed by the arrival of the Red Legion mecha with their powerful onboard electronic warfare pods. All command and control had broken down, and it was now small unit actions, every soldier relying on their own skill and luck to survive. Stalker dragged himself back towards the shattered plascrete ditch, and through a gap in a rapidly thinning smoke he saw what had destroyed the enemy mech locking his jaw against the pane and using his rifle to lean on. Stalker wobbly stood to get a better view. Out on the distant fields, red mecha and armor were beginning to stream away from the shattered base as they swung to face a new threat. Advancing towards the Red Legion forces were hundreds of mecha, not painted the dirty red of the enemy, but the multiple different colors of the UEDF's elite mecha battalions. Crawling, Stalker fell into the ditch and almost on top of Schur, who was trying to seal up a wound to his shoulder with a pressure pack of medical trauma sealant. Stalker helped him, and once he was patched up, he crawled out of the ditch and almost shot D by mistake, who was dragging himself the other way. Do I look like a fucking red? Now that you mention it. No, said Stalker as he lowered his rifle. They both slid back into the ditch. There was still gunfire and fighting going on in and around the base, but the majority of the Red Legion forces had now pulled out. D looked Stalker up and down. When blazes happened to you? Stalker realized he was covered in blood and gore. I was playing knights, and Stalker tapped the bloody sword at his hip. Jesus, said D, looking at the blade. Sure, he looked from D to Stalker. Did you see Javinus? They both said nothing. There was nothing to say. Looking rather comical, all three had to help each other up the shattered plascrete edge of the ditch so they could see what was going on. Comms were still down, but it was clear that the primary focus of the battle had shifted back out onto the plain. Stalker used his EEA helmet's vision enhancement to zoom in as much as he could. He saw Red Legion armor pouring back the way they had come in considerable disorder, while further out an intense mech engagement was underway. The horizon was lit up by the multicolored flashes of railguns, sniper, pulse, and autocannons. There were also clusters of explosions as missiles were fired, and mecha maneuver furiously, laser swords flashing against the darkening sky. They were too far from the center of combat to make out any fine detail, but as Dee and Shur covered, searching for targets amongst the chaos around the shattered base, Stalker gave them a running commentary of what he could see. Stalker saw that despite the Reds having the bases in their very grasp, they had clearly had enough and were withdrawing, their mecha covering the retreat as the UEDF mecha and air power harried them at every turn. Stalker could see close assault-type mecha with their squatter profile. They were armed with dual-arm mounted laser swords, their hand weapon stations clasping flamethrowers and massive shotguns, and they were using their up-rated maneuvering thrusters to engage the Red Legion mecha in furious close combat. There were also fire support mecha with their twin autocannons and shoulder-mounted pods of lethal long-range Hellstrike missiles positioned further back, busy pummeling the withdrawing Red Legion formations. Battalions of wolf pattern mecha armed with an assortment of long rail guns, sniper cannons, plasma weapons, and missile pods of every type were harassing the flanks of the enemy mecha and armored formations, moving in perfect coordination on their ion thrusters. There were also several 4-machine units of UEDF Goliaths on the field, the huge machines attracting a lot of fire, but as Stalker watched, he saw the rail and various cannon fire glance off their super advanced armor and energy dispersal shields. They moved less fluidly than the smaller mecha, but brought a truly terrifying amount of firepower to the battlefield. As Stalker watched, he saw 4 UEDF Goliaths target a Red Legion Goliath that had somehow become disabled. With a flash that, even at the considerable distance, made his helmet automatically darken, all 4 directed their pulse cannons onto the hapless enemy machine. With the damaged Goliath's energy dispersal shields already down, it was reduced to a molten wreck, the debris from its demise knocking over several enemy mecha that were unfortunate enough to be close by. While Stalker continued his observation and commentary of the rapidly receding clash on the plain, the battle in and around the ruined base had finally swung in the favor of the heavily depleted defenders. One by one, the strong points the Reds had established were stormed or picked off, and an uneasy silence descended, broken only occasionally by the rumble of explosions sounding like a distant thunderstorm. The destruction and carnage in and around the base was absolute. The wreckage of hundreds of vehicles with a smaller number of striders and mecha were surrounded by the crumpled forms of thousands of dead and dying soldiers. Most were Reds, but amongst them were a frightful number of fallen assault troops, the entire scene coated by the ever-present dust. With the battle now moving to far away for even Stalker's magnified sight to make out the commentary on the battle ended, Stalker soon noticed a large formation of fast-skimming mecha heading towards the base. All were covered in a silver and black splinter camouflage pattern, which stood out against the trampled green fields over which they were moving. Darkness was falling fast, and looking at a number on his HUD, Stalker saw it was now 1825 local time. Stalker recalled from a briefing that the Martian day was longer than an Earth day, having an extra 39.5 minutes. Within moments, the mecha formation swept over the base, their sensors and crew seeking targets, but finding none. The surviving battered defenders raising an audible but ragged cheer as the lethal-looking machines spread out and secured the area. One of the mechs stopped just near Stalker's position, a carnivore pattern mech, Stalker noted. A bipedal mech killer with wicked-looking twin railguns, Hellstrike missile pods, and an underslung multi-barreled autocannon. As it halted and settled on its massive legs, Stalker saw the underslung cannon swing onto him. But he wasn't concerned. He guessed it was slave to the pilot's helmet, and he gave the machine a wave. Stalker noted a few of the awesome machine's finer details. It was topped by a small, flat, rotating radar. Several of the individual missile tubes in the Hellstrike pods had their covers blown off, indicating that they had been fired. The muzzles of the railguns were blackened from firing, and several small impacts were evident on the armor. On the side of the main fuselage was a picture of a vicious-looking dinosaur with a clawed hand resting on a number 8 that was dripping with blood. Stalker recalled it from a unit recognition manual he had studied long ago. It was the emblem of the 8th Mech Hunter Battalion, the Vultures, a hunter-killer unit specializing in anti-mech operations, and for what Stalker recalled an elite unit even within the UEDF's mecha formations. As Stalker, D, and Schur watched, there was a whir and clicking of servos and gyros. The mech's legs pivoted to the sides, and the main body, which normally stood twice as high as a Strider, was lowered much closer to the ground. Looking almost comical, the massive machine of war squatted. Now with its main fuselage much lower, a hatch opened and a ladder extended, a black-suited figure rapidly descending and lightly touching the ground. The moment the man touched terra firma, the ladder retracted, and with amazing fluidness, the mech raised itself back up to full height before once again becoming motionless. The dismounted occupant seemed not to even notice as he strode confidently over towards the bedraggled-looking group of Stalker, D, and Schur. As he got closer, Stalker caught a flash of insignia on his pristine uniform, his face still hidden behind his flight helmet. "Oh shit, stars!" And as one holding each other, the three rose to standing and came to attention and saluted. The unknown general stopped in front of them and returned the salute with practiced ease. The three assault men, noting the name badge on his uniform, General W. Bryce, Rapier. "At ease," he said in a clear, firm voice that seemed to cut through the air like a knife. "Report, Battle Commander Schur, Philistines Division, Unit Commander Donaldson, Acting Commander of Terra Nova Forces in the field." The general nodded and looked to Stalker. "Sub-Unit Commander Terra Nova. They call me Stalker, sir. My acting second in command," D added. The general with a click removed his helmet, revealing a man in his 50s with hard green eyes. The first hint of gray was coming through his wavy hair, which somehow, like the rest of him, seemed immaculate. The man fixed his eyes on Stalker, seeming to see through the darkened visor. "Well, Sub-Commander Stalker, you're a unit commander now, and you Unit Commander Donaldson, you're now Battle Commander Donaldson." He turned on Schur. "Battle Commander Schur, was it? You're now Assault Commander Schur. I'll be damned if I'm not going to promote every man I find here, still alive, personally." The three assault men stared back, not sure what to say to the green-eyed general. "Now you men take it easy. You look dead on your feet." Schur spoke. "With respect, sir, we have men down in the field. I have requested fleet medical deploy trauma teams here with all possible speed. You have done your bit today. They will be taken care of. You have my word, Commander." Without another word, the general moved off towards another group of men nearby. With a grunt, all three sat back down, none of them in any shape to do anything. General Bryce was soon surrounded by a small group of men, including the surviving senior officers of the Excalibur, Viking, Crusader, Praetorian, Infantry, Mechanized, and Armor divisions, and was giving out promotions like candy. Soon after, dozens of LTTs began landing, and medical teams, many of them wearing naval uniforms, poured forth, fanning out in all directions, checking the bodies and wounded as they did. Several high-priority medevac cases were passed over the now-restored TACnet, and LTTs were landed on site. As the minutes passed, HTTs and HCTs brought in a complete field hospital, which was set up within the ruined base's perimeter, one of several established along the remnants of the defensive line between the two FOBs. D was carted away by the medics for treatment for suspected broken ribs and internal bleeding, while Schur, after minor treatment, had left to see what remained of his division. Stalker refused any help. There were men who needed it more, and leaning on an impulse rifle, he watched in silence as a detail of 6 battle-scarred Praetorians carried Jovinus's shattered body to a waiting Praetorian transport. They had refused anyone else permission to move the body, despite the fact they were to a man wounded themselves, and were so tired that they swayed on their feet. It was one of the most saddening and at the same time glorious things Stalker had ever been privileged to witness, and he was glad of his helmet to hide the tears he knew were welling up in his eyes. Even in their exhaustion, the Praetorians stood tall and moved in parade ground step, as if moving to an invisible beat. All around them, soldiers from all units stopped and watched, knowing that they were seeing some rare humanity on this nightmarish battlefield so far from home and their loved ones. Once they slid the stretcher bearing the prone body of Jovinus onto the purple Praetorian LTT, they stepped back, and the men saluted their fallen comrade. One of the men, in obvious grief, had his legs begin to buckle beneath him and was steadied by his comrades. Stalker had not known Jovinus outside of the battles they had shared on Mars, but it was clear he was loved and respected by the men who served under him, and like a lot of men who fell that day, he would be missed.